A war of decolonization during the Cold War. It's a classic story from so much of recent African or Asian history. But this simple premise lacks nuance. Imagine a war between two post-colonial states and featuring two more that don't even exist today. This is a war that was undeclared, but unambiguously a war. It involves two of the great Cold War superpowers, but not the United States or the Soviet Union. It technically ended with a victory for a colonial power, which then left its colonies in the process. Oh, and it was only considered to be a war of decolonization by one of the belligerents. I'm your host David, and today we are going to talk about Konfrontasi, the, confrontation between Indonesia and the newly formed Malaysia. This is the Cold War. Now, before we get into today's video, I want to let you know about a fantastic video I watched recently, Asia, the Tectonics of Life and Death, part of the Voyage of the Continents series on Magellan TV. The video tells the story of how tectonic drift created the Asian continent as we know it now, including the formation of the mighty Himalayan mountains, as well as a mass extinction. The video really brought home to me how geography is so instrumental in how the history of the world has unfolded, and that no matter what, the Earth will endure despite even drastic changes to those living on it. And I have to say, one of the best things about the video is that it is completely ad-free, just like every video on Magellan TV, including the new 4K content that is being added every week. And Cold War viewers will get a 1-month free trial by clicking on the link in the description. Make sure to start your free trial of Magellan TV so you can join us in watching Asia, the Tectonics of Life and Death. Okay, so let's start by talking a bit about the region. Our first protagonist, Indonesia, was a massive post-colonial state which had won its independence in a brutal war against the Netherlands, and as the Konfrontasi was starting, Indonesia was just about to bring an end to the last echoes of their war of independence by means of the West New Guinea dispute. The country was dominated by the political regime of President Sukarno and viewed itself as a new emerging force, its official term by the way, in a global struggle against colonialism and imperialism. Our second protagonist, Malaysia, didn't exist in 1961, at least not as Malaysia. There was the Federation of Malaya, another post-colonial state. It had achieved independence from the British through a complicated process which, although it had had its challenges, allowed Kuala Lumpur to maintain warm relations with London. Then there was Singapore, a British colony that had achieved self-rule in 1959. And across the southern part of the South China Sea, there was British Borneo, consisting of two colonies, Sarawak and North Borneo, also known as Sabah, as well as the British protectorate state of Brunei. Now, to understand how Malaysia came about, we need to first look at Singapore. In the 1950s, this city was in the process of obtaining self-rule from Britain and had developed a remarkable and active trade union movement. In 1955, 1/3 of gainfully employed Singaporeans were members of the Singapore Factory and Shop Workers Union, which itself was just one of the trade unions operating in the city. Between 1955 and 1961, there were a total of 554 different strikes. The left was a force to be reckoned with and lent its political support to a party it considered to be the most progressive, the People's Action Party, the PAP, led by Lee Kuan Yew. After a sweeping PAP victory in the 1959 elections, Lee Kuan Yew became Singapore's prime minister as the city obtained full internal self-government. This active leftist movement, however, raised concerns in Kuala Lumpur. Malaya still had fresh memories of the emergency, the counterinsurgency war that had been waged against mostly communist and mostly Chinese guerrillas. A potential independent, leftist, and overwhelmingly Chinese Singapore just across the Straits of Johor was perceived in Malaya in a similar way that the US viewed Cuba. Hoping that the city would remain British forever was, to put it mildly, not an option, but simply annexing Singapore into Malaya would result in the Chinese community in the amalgamated state outnumbering the number of Malay citizens nationwide, which would have been an unacceptable situation for Malaya's right-wing political elites. A solution was publicly proposed by Malaya's Prime Minister Tunku Abdul Rahman on May 27, 1961. Malaya today as a nation realizes that she cannot stand alone and in isolation. Sooner or later, she should have an understanding with Britain and the peoples of Singapore, North Borneo, Brunei, and Sarawak. It is premature for me to say now how this closer understanding can be brought about, but it is inevitable that we should look ahead to this objective and think of a plan whereby those territories can be brought closer together in political and economic cooperation. To make a long story a bit shorter, Malaya would form a political union not just with Singapore, but also with British Borneo. The brainchild of British policymakers, this idea was acceptable for Tunku since the formation of a Chinese majority would thus be prevented. Lee Kuan Yew himself was quite wary of the popularity of the Singaporean left, also supported the merger even though it cost him politically with a loss of some support from the PAP. Even Indonesia initially expressed no objections, although they did note that British Borneo is naturally, ethnographically, and geographically closer to Indonesian Borneo than it is to Malaya. So, no objections, right? Well, in British Borneo and Brunei, things were not as simple. Now, normally we don't talk about Brunei. It's not that we don't want to, we just don't get a chance to very often. So for this episode, it brings us a great deal of excitement to talk about Brunei. It was a British protectorate, a sultanate, the smallest of the 3 British territories in the region, and by far the richest thanks to its oil industry. In the 1950s, it was the site of a political struggle between the British, Sultan, and the Brunei People's Party, the PRB. The initial British plan for the region was to unite the 3 colonies of Brunei, North Borneo, and Sarawak into the North Borneo Federation, sort of another Malaya, just on the other side of the South China Sea. The PRB supported the formation of the federation, but preferred that it be ruled by the Sultan of Brunei as a constitutional monarchy. The Sultan, however, was not a fan of the idea. The federation would drain oil money away from Brunei, while at the same time bring political instability to the Sultanate. In 1959, the Sultan initiated a constitutional change, with the first legislative elections being planned for 1961. The PRB was not satisfied, however, since the proposed constitution still contained elements of absolute monarchy. This situation was not made any better by the Sultan's rather suspicious maneuvering, like forming a military or even postponing the election by a year. Once the proposal of a merger with Malaya and Singapore became public, the Sultan showed support for it, while the left-leaning PRB opposed it vigorously. When elections were finally held in 1962, the PRB clearly won. However, the opening of Parliament was postponed, and then postponed again, without any reasonable explanation. In the absence of the PRB delegates, though, a temporary National Assembly, which conveniently was composed of supporters of the Sultan, approved Brunei's unification with Malaya. The PRB, after several months of preparations, launched a rebellion. On the 8th of December 1962, the PRB's armed wing, the North Kalimantan National Army, attempted to capture the police headquarters, the Sultan's palace, and the house of the chief minister. But as is so often the case in this type of rebellion, coordination was poor and the attempt failed. Many were arrested and thousands fled to Indonesia. A state of emergency was declared in Brunei, dissolving all political institutions. Together with Britain, Malaya provided logistical and police support to the Sultan, and the Malay Prime Minister openly condemned Indonesia as the main actor behind the Brunei revolt. And it wasn't an entirely groundless accusation either, since Indonesia had assisted in the training of the rebel army officers. Indonesia, as you might expect, denied the accusations, but praised the revolt as a struggle for independence and happiness against colonialism and imperialism, and also neo-colonialism. It's in this increasingly heated rhetoric between Indonesia and Malaya where we first hear about Konfrontasi. Even though the first guerrilla raids against Sarawak and Sabah are attributed to this initial period of confrontation, all the sides involved were still ready to give peace a chance. And we're not talking about just Malaya and Indonesia at this point. The Philippines made a claim on Sabah, entering the chat. When the representatives of Malaya, Indonesia, and the Philippines met in Manila in June 1963, they agreed on 2 things: that the merger of northern Borneo into Malaysia should be conditional on the willingness of its people to do so, and that the threat of a Chinese communist advance in the region was real and unwanted. To counter the latter, the three nations agreed to form Mafilindo, a loose confederation aimed at drowning out 7 million ethnic Chinese in a sea of 125 million Malays, Indonesians, and Filipinos who have a somewhat shared ethnic ancestry. A UN mission was then invited to North Borneo to conduct a plebiscite there. The implementation, however, ran into problems. Prior to the mission's arrival, Tunku had gone to London to sign the Federation Agreement with Britain, Singapore, Sarawak, and Sabah. By this time, by the way, Brunei had decided not to join. The Federation Agreement was based on the results of the Kobold Commission, which had earlier gone to North Borneo and stated that a third of the locals wanted to join Malaysia, a third objected, and a third would agree to the merger under a condition that certain safeguards would be introduced. The Kobold Commission, we should point out, was not independent, as its members came either from the British Colonial Office or the Malayan government. With the UN mission's arrival, the establishment of Malaysia was postponed, but the concept remained unchallenged. The assessment teams were handpicked, and the British were fairly certain that the UN mission would produce mostly the same results as the Kobold Commission, which is exactly what happened. Indonesia, however, was left dissatisfied with the plebiscite and described the mission as hasty and illegitimate. Sukarno's position on the about-to-be-born Malaysia leaves little room for interpretation. Malaysia is endangering the Indonesian Revolution. To crush Malaysia, we must launch a confrontation in all fields. On the 16th of September 1963, Malaysia's first day of existence, the British and Malaysian embassies in Jakarta, as well as the Indonesian embassy in Kuala Lumpur, were all stoned. Raids were carried out from Indonesia into northern Borneo, mostly by irregular forces and volunteers. From the beginning of 1964, they became more systematic, and the use of regular Indonesian army troops became more frequent. The main burden of defending Malaysia fell on Britain and her Commonwealth allies, Australia and New Zealand. At the peak of the Konfrontasi, Britain and her allies had committed 68,000 troops and as many as 80 vessels to the Far East. The key components of those security forces were primarily infantry battalions, particularly the Special Air Service and Gurkha regiments. By the end of 1964, the death toll in Konfrontasi between Malaysia and Indonesia stood at over 100 Malaysians. As for Indonesia, it has been claimed that 282 Indonesians were killed, with more than 400 captured and 70 wounded. But this low-level war wasn't the only problem for Malaysia to deal with. There were also race riots. Relations between the Malay and Chinese communities have always been, as you probably know by now, complicated. On July 21, 1964, as a Muslim procession marched through the streets of Singapore, violence erupted, spreading to nearby neighborhoods. It's unclear what sparked the riot, however, in this tense atmosphere, the most decisive event of Konfrontasi happened. On September 2nd, Indonesia sent an infiltration force of about 100 paratroopers into Labas in Malaya proper. With the concurrent movement of British warships in the region, the conflict was on the verge of becoming a full-scale war. Malaysia lodged a complaint to the UN Security Council, declaring Indonesia's actions as blatant and inexcusable aggression. Indonesia conceded the charges, but claimed in response that the domestic disorder in Malaysia, which included such things as race riots, was evidence of Malaysia's non-viability rather than the result of Indonesian subversion. The UN resolution against Indonesia was blocked by a Soviet veto. It's at this point that the situation for Indonesia became uneasy. The United States did not support Konfrontasi and cancelled $400 million in economic aid, which had previously been planned for Indonesia. After threatening to cut off all the remaining aid if Konfrontasi continued, Sukarno, ever prideful and sensitive about yielding to foreign pressure, told the US to go to hell with their aid. Now, we've seen situations like this before on this channel, where a country turns its back on the United States, and the Soviet Union would normally be there with open arms, ready to greet a new comrade. But this time Indonesian relations with the Soviet Union were rather frosty as well, since Indonesia had failed to repay some Soviet loans on time. This was also at a time where the USSR was experimenting with the strategy of peaceful coexistence with the US and didn't want to risk escalating a conflict between Malaysia and Indonesia any further. Under these circumstances, Sukarno then turned to Beijing. The Indonesian Communist Party, the third largest in the world at the time, favored China over the Soviet Union. China had tested its first nuclear weapon in 1964, a demonstration of the country's strength, which also increased its attractiveness as a potential ally. Indonesian rhetoric at that time was strongly anti-colonial and increasingly anti-Western, which was well compatible with the CCP commitment to support national liberation struggles around the world. In January 1965, when Malaysia became a non-permanent member of the UN Security Council, Indonesia, in an unprecedented move, withdrew from the organization. Beijing endorsed this action, calling for a new international organization to rival the UN. The two countries' cooperation continued. The PRC supported Indonesia with a loan of between $50 million and $100 million. A new conference was planned, which was supposed to unite the PRC, Indonesia, North Korea, North Vietnam, and Cambodia into what became popularly known as the Beijing-Jakarta Axis. This development, however, had an effect on Indonesia's domestic politics. At the start of Konfrontasi, the key political forces in the country were the army on one side and the Indonesian Communist Party, the PKI, on the other. Sukarno managed to keep the balance between these two, but as Indonesia's economic situation deteriorated, he had to rely on external conflicts in order to rally the nation. The West New Guinea dispute was one of them, and once that was resolved, Konfrontasi had already begun. In these conflicts, the army and the communists competed against each other, framing themselves as the more patriotic force compared to the other. However, as the army failed to make sufficient progress and Jakarta's ties with Beijing grew, that delicate balance was broken. On September 30th, 1965, a sudden coup against Sukarno occurred, involving the murder of 6 army generals. The commander of the Strategic Reserve, Major General Suharto, rallied loyalist troops and crushed the coup. The blame was put on the PKI. Over the course of the next few years, Suharto would replace Sukarno as president, and Indonesia would witness terrifyingly large-scale mass killings and targeting suspected communists. These events, known as G30S, the Indonesian Purge or Indonesian Genocide, saw anywhere from 500,000 dead to as many as 3 million dead. We will be doing dedicated episodes to these events, but for now, let's establish that Suharto wasn't keen on continuing Sukarno's foreign policies. Indonesia cancelled its alignment with the PRC and rejoined the UN. Meanwhile, events were happening in Malaysia as well. To simplify things here, following a series of controversies regarding the preferential rights of Malays over those of Chinese and Indian minorities, Malaysia and Singapore parted ways. Look for a separate episode on Singapore in the future as well. With those two major events having taken place, Indonesia and Malaysia looked for a rapprochement. Secret talks were held in Bangkok, and just like that, on August 11, 1966, a joint peace treaty was signed in Jakarta. Konfrontasi was over. So what was it all about? A conflict to liberate North Borneans from neo-colonialist oppression? Indonesian aggression against Malaysia? A plan to stop the Chinese takeover of the region, which just went really wrong? A series of unfortunate events stemming from the Sultan of Brunei being reluctant to share political power. Well, it was a bit of everything. Konfrontasi is a perfect example of how small changes and events in one place can have a tremendous ripple effect and cause chaos and distortion elsewhere, which then cause their own ripples, and so on and so forth. It wasn't just the threat of colonialism. It wasn't just ethnic and national rivalries. It wasn't just ideology. It was all of these combined. We hope you've enjoyed this episode, and to make sure you don't miss our future work, please make sure you send guerrilla forces into the jungles of Borneo in order to alert the crack team of paratroopers to press the bell button. Please consider supporting us on Patreon at patreon.com/thecoldwar or through YouTube membership. We can be reached via email at thecoldwarchannel@gmail.com. This is the Cold War Channel, and as we think about the Cold War, please remember that history is shades of gray and rarely black and white.